Spiritual warfare is real, and the enemy will try everything to attack, discourage, or deceive us. But here's the thing, our real weapon in this fight, it's on our knees. Tonight, we're diving into the story of David, the newly established king of Israel, and his deep desire to put God at the center of everything. David, who is a true worshiper at heart, wants to make sure God is the focal point of the entire nation. And his first major act as king, he sets out to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, the symbol of God's presence with Israel. But as we'll see, things don't go exactly as planned at first. Let's walk through this journey together. David had just been established as the king over all of Israel, but it wasn't always like this. Initially, he only ruled over Judah, his own tribe, for 7 years. It was after the death of King Saul that the rest of Israel finally accepted him as God's anointed king. This was a turning point, not only for David, but for the entire nation. For the first time, Israel was united under one king, and with that unity came David's desire to center everything around worship of God. He knew that in order for Israel to truly flourish, God had to be at the heart of their identity, their leadership, and their future. Now, David had one thing in mind, bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. You see, the Ark wasn't just a box or a piece of religious furniture. No, this was the very symbol of God's presence with his people. The Ark was where the glory of God would dwell, between the golden cherubim, and where the high priest would meet God on behalf of the people. For David, bringing the Ark to Jerusalem meant making God the center of their worship and their lives, and he wanted Israel to know that. But the journey to bring the Ark back to Jerusalem didn't exactly go as smoothly as David had hoped. You might remember the first attempt he made to transport the Ark. David, in his excitement, had the Ark placed on a cart drawn by oxen, and he brought it up to Jerusalem with great celebration. The people were excited. Music filled the air. They were dancing, praising, and celebrating the move of God. But then, something unexpected happened. As they were traveling, the oxen stumbled. The Ark, as it swayed on the cart, began to tip. And in that moment, a man named Uzzah, who was helping to guide the Ark, reached out his hand to steady it. The moment his hand touched the Ark, everything stopped. Uzzah was struck down by God, and he died on the spot. Can you imagine the shock and grief in that moment? The music stopped, and what should have been a moment of great joy turned into a moment of terror. David didn't know what to do. He was upset, confused, and afraid. Why would God let something like this happen? After all, they were just trying to bring the Ark back to its rightful place. But in his grief, David realized something. They had not followed the proper instructions. The Ark was never meant to be carried on a cart. God had given specific directions in the law of Moses for how the Ark should be transported. It was supposed to be carried by Levites, using poles placed through rings on the sides of the Ark. No cart, no oxen. It had to be carried carefully, reverently, with honor. David, realizing this mistake, decided to put the whole thing on hold. He couldn't understand why Uzzah had been struck down, but he knew one thing, something had gone wrong, and until he figured it out, he wasn't going to risk making another mistake. So he left the Ark in the house of a man named Obed-Edom, and there it stayed for 3 months. During those 3 months, something incredible happened. God's blessing rested on the house of Obed-Edom. The Bible says that everything Obed-Edom had was blessed. His household, his possessions, everything. The presence of God, represented by the Ark, brought blessings and peace. David must have heard about this blessing and realized something important. God's presence was not a curse, but a blessing. It was meant to bring peace, joy, and favor. But even as the Ark stayed in Obed-Edom's house, there was still a sense of fear and awe surrounding it. The people knew that the Ark represented the very presence of God, and they respected it deeply. There was no flippancy here. People weren't taking it lightly. No one dared to approach the Ark without a deep sense of reverence. So, for 3 months, the Ark remained in Obed-Edom's home. And while the blessings were flowing in that house, David too was learning valuable lessons. He took the time to reflect on what had happened, to pray, and to search the scriptures to understand God's instructions on how to move the Ark properly. This wasn't just about logistics, it was about reverence, obedience, and honor toward God. And after those 3 months, David was ready to try again, but this time he would do it right. Now, think about the tension David must have felt. On the one hand, he was deeply excited to finally bring the ark to Jerusalem. On the other hand, he knew he couldn't make the same mistake twice. He had to get it right this time, not just for the people, but for the glory of God. The whole nation was watching, and he wanted this to be a celebration of God's presence, but one done with the right heart and the right actions. But imagine how Obed-Edom must have felt. For 3 months, he had the ark in his home. It wasn't just a decoration. It was the literal presence of God in his midst. And during that time, Obed-Edom had to treat it with great respect and reverence, just as David would later do when he brought it into Jerusalem. I can only imagine that Obed-Edom had moments of awe and perhaps even fear, wondering if he would make a mistake, if God would strike him down for something. But in the end, the ark brought blessing to him and his family, and David could see the proof that God's presence, when treated with honor, brought life and favor. David's decision to pause the transport of the ark was not a decision made out of fear alone, but out of a desire to honor God in the best way possible. He wanted to make sure the ark was brought to Jerusalem in a way that respected God's commands, knowing that God was not just interested in the act itself, but in the heart behind it. David realized that obedience to God's word was key to experiencing his blessings. When the ark was finally ready to move again, it wasn't just an event for David, it was a moment of profound significance for the entire nation. The ark's journey symbolized something bigger than just a physical move of a sacred object. It was about making God central again to Israel's identity, ensuring that he would be the one who guided, protected, and blessed them as they move forward as a unified nation. So here we are. After these 3 months of waiting, reflecting, and learning, David is now ready to bring the ark to Jerusalem, and the lessons he learned along the way, the importance of reverence, the need for obedience, and the understanding that God's presence is a blessing, would stay with him for the rest of his reign. This was not just about a king trying to build a city or a nation. This was about a king who understood that the foundation of any kingdom, any people, was built on God himself. And David was determined to make sure that Israel knew that the ark was more than just a piece of history. It was the living presence of God, and it would be central to everything they did from that moment forward. So, as David settles into his role as king, things start to look up for Israel. The ark is on its way to Jerusalem, the nation is united, and peace is beginning to take root. But just as things seem to be going well, the Philistines, the perennial enemies of Israel, begin to stir. They heard that David had been anointed king over all of Israel, and that was a problem. You see, the Philistines had never been on good terms with Israel, and now that David was firmly established as king, they wanted to fight. They didn't want to just sit back and let David and Israel grow stronger. No, they saw this as a threat to their power and influence, and they moved swiftly to confront it. Now, David's reaction to the Philistine threat is what stands out to me here. It's easy, when we're faced with challenges or threats, to go into problem-solving mode. We often try to figure things out on our own, relying on our own strength, wisdom, or connections. But David, right from the start, doesn't go into battle on his own. No, instead, he does something powerful and simple. He seeks God's guidance through prayer. In 1 Chronicles 14:10, we read that David inquired of God. Now, this is a small but incredibly significant detail. When the enemy comes against him, David doesn't charge ahead in his own strength or follow his own instincts. Instead, he asks God for direction. Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hand? David's first response is to take it to God in prayer. And notice the kind of prayer it is. It's specific. David doesn't just ask if God will help him. He asks if God will deliver the Philistines into his hands. He's seeking clear direction and intervention. And God responds. He doesn't leave David hanging. God answers his prayer and says, "Go up, for I will deliver them into your hand." It's like God is saying, "David, don't worry, I've got this." And what happens next? David goes up, they fight, and they win. The Philistines are defeated, and David recognizes that it's God who gave the victory. In fact, David says something powerful after the battle. He says, "God has broken through my enemies by my hand like a breakthrough of water." What an image. It's like the floodgates opened, and God moved in a way that was undeniable. But here's where it gets really interesting. After the first victory, the Philistines, as you might expect, aren't done. They come back for more. In verse 13, it says that the Philistines once again made a raid on the valley. Now, imagine this for a second. David has just won a huge victory. He's seen God's hand move powerfully. It would be easy to think, okay, we've got this. We've already won, so let's just go out and do it again. But that's not what David does. He doesn't assume that because God helped him once, he's automatically going to do the same thing again. Instead, David inquires again of God. Now, I think this is such an important moment for us to reflect on. How often do we, when faced with challenges, just assume that because we've prayed and God helped us once, we can do it all on our own the next time? But David shows us a different way. Even after the victory, he goes back to God and asks again, "What should I do this time? What's the plan for this next battle?" And once again, God responds. And here's the fascinating part, God's strategy changes. In verse 14, God tells David, "You shall not go up after them. Circle around them and come upon them in front of the mulberry trees." What's incredible here is that God doesn't give David the same plan he did last time. The strategy has changed. God gives David a new plan. He's to circle around and wait for a specific sign, the sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees. Only then is David supposed to move forward. I love this because it shows that spiritual warfare is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not like, well, we've done this before, so let's just do the same thing again. No, David's second victory came through a completely different strategy. And that's how it often works in life. Sometimes, when we're facing a battle, we think that just because something worked before, it'll work again. But God may have a new way of leading us. He may have a new strategy for us to follow. And it requires us to stay in tune with Him, asking for His guidance every time. David didn't just assume he knew what to do. He kept seeking God, and God kept answering him. So, David listens to God's specific instructions. He circles around, waits for the signal, and when he hears the sound of marching in the trees, he moves forward. And once again, God gives him the victory. The Philistines are defeated again, and David knows that it wasn't his own strength or tactics that won the battle, but God's guidance and intervention. The principle here is so powerful. David shows us that when we face challenges, whether they're big or small, our first response should always be to seek God in prayer, and not just once, but continually. Spiritual warfare is real, and the enemy will keep coming at us, trying to wear us down, deceive us, and make us feel defeated. But David teaches us that our weapon is prayer, and our strength comes from God. When we fight on our knees, we're inviting God to lead us and give us the victory. It's not about our own wisdom, power, or strategies. It's about asking God, what do you want me to do? How do you want me to fight this battle? And then trusting Him to respond with the guidance we need when in our own lives. When we face struggles, whether it's personal, relational, financial, or spiritual, do we go to God first? Do we ask for His direction? Or do we try to figure it out on our own? The good news is that just like David, when we inquire of God, He's there to respond. We might not always get the same answer or the same plan each time, but we can trust that God's way is always the best way. When we fight on our knees, we're aligning ourselves with His power and His will, and that's a powerful place to be. So, let's remember David's example when the enemy comes against us. Let's fight on our knees, continually seeking God's guidance. And let's trust that He will lead us to victory, just as He did with David. After the victory over the Philistines, something incredible happened. As David and his army continued their pursuit, they came upon the Philistine idols, those carved images that the enemy worshipped in place of the one true God. You see, for the Philistines, their gods were more than just religious symbols. They were representations of their power, their strength, and their way of life. But here's the thing, when you truly encounter the living God, everything else fades into nothing. Those little idols, those false gods, were nothing compared to the real, powerful, and living God who had just delivered David and his people from their enemies. And so, David did something profound in response to this victory, instead of just leaving the idols behind or taking them as spoils of war. David ordered that they be destroyed. In 1 Chronicles 14:12, we read that David commanded that the Philistine idols be burned with fire. Now, this wasn't just a symbolic act, it was a direct response to the law of God. You see, in the book of Deuteronomy, God had given clear instructions about what the Israelites were to do when they defeated pagan nations and came across their idols. In Deuteronomy 7:5 and 7:25, God told his people that they were to destroy these idols completely. No taking the gold or silver from them, no keeping them as trophies. They were to be burned. This was because, in God's eyes, these idols were abominations. They represented false worship, and God wanted to make it clear that there was no place for such things in the life of his people. So, David obeyed. He followed God's law and burned the idols, showing that he recognized the importance of keeping God's commands above all else. But here's where it gets a little tricky. While David was obedient in following God's law regarding the destruction of idols, there were other areas in his life where his obedience wasn't as strong. And it's important for us to notice this because it's a reminder that we can't pick and choose which parts of God's law we want to follow. David, despite his great victories and his heart for worship, had a personal weakness that he struggled with throughout his life. He took many wives. Now, we don't need to dive too deep into the cultural or historical context of this, but the point is that David's taking multiple wives was never God's design. In Deuteronomy 17:17, God specifically commanded that the king should not multiply wives for himself. This was for a few reasons: to prevent his heart from being led astray by foreign influences, to avoid personal division within his household, and to ensure that he would remain focused on his relationship with God rather than being distracted by his own desires. But David, despite all his godly actions, failed in this area. The Bible tells us that David had many wives, and though he might have been a great warrior, a powerful king, and a man after God's own heart, this personal failure was a serious weakness in his life. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because this contrast between David's obedience in some areas and disobedience in others serves as a lesson for us all. It's so easy to look at someone like David, a man who defeated giants, who wrote beautiful psalms, and who had a heart for God, and think, wow, he had it all together. But David's life reminds us that no one is perfect. We all have areas where we fall short, where we miss the mark. It's easy to justify our mistakes or weaknesses. Maybe David did in his heart with his many wives, but God calls us to obedience in every area of our lives, not just the ones we feel comfortable with. And that's why it's so important for us to look at David's victories as well as his mistakes. His obedience in destroying the idols is something to be celebrated. He honored God by doing what God had commanded, and as a result, God brought victory to Israel. But his failure to honor God's design for his family life serves as a reminder that no matter how well we're doing in one area, we can't neglect the other areas of our lives. God calls us to follow his commands fully, not partially. David's obedience in dealing with the Philistine idols brought victory to Israel. It honored God and showed that David was willing to make the hard choices, even when it meant going against the cultural norms of his time. But his personal failure in taking many wives also had consequences. It didn't just impact his relationship with God, it affected his family, his kingdom, and the generations that followed him. We see the effects of this disobedience in his own sons and the conflicts that arose within his household. The truth is, God's commands are given to us for a reason. They aren't arbitrary rules meant to make our lives harder. They are designed to protect us and help us live in the fullness of his blessings. When we choose to obey God in every area of our lives, we open ourselves up to his favor and blessing. But when we choose to ignore his commands, even in small areas, we open ourselves up to unnecessary struggles and consequences. David's life is a powerful reminder that while obedience in one area of life is important, it's just as important to follow God's commands in every area. We can't compartmentalize our faith. We can't say, I'll obey God here, but not over here. When we truly commit to following God, we need to follow his word in its entirety. This doesn't mean we'll be perfect, but it does mean that we're willing to submit every part of our lives to God's will. So, as we look at David's victory over the Philistines and the burning of their idols, let it remind us that God calls us to destroy the idols in our own lives. It might not be physical statues that we worship, but there are plenty of things, relationships, habits, desires that we sometimes place above God. We must be willing to burn those things down, to rid ourselves of anything that pulls our hearts away from God. But let's also remember that David's failure with his many wives is a cautionary tale. It's not just about the big victories in life. It's about living in obedience to God in the quiet, everyday decisions as well. Whether it's our family life, our finances, our friendships, or our personal desires, God calls us to follow His commands in every area. When we do, we honor Him and He brings blessing into our lives. When we don't, we risk missing out on the fullness of His plan for us. David's victories were incredible, but his failures remind us of the importance of wholehearted obedience to God. It's not enough to just do what's right in some areas. God wants us to honor Him in all things, and when we do, we'll see the full extent of His blessing and favor in our lives. The Philistine idols were burned, and the victory was won. But let's remember that obedience to God's entire word is what brings true victory, not just in battle, but in every area of our lives. After everything that had happened with the ark, after Uzzah's tragic death, after the 3 months it spent in Obed-Edom's house, David finally came to a crucial realization. Now, he knew that it was time to bring the ark to Jerusalem, but this time, it would be different. The previous attempt had been filled with excitement, celebration, and zeal, but it had ended in disaster. Uzzah had been struck down, and David was left wondering why it had happened, why God had allowed it. The answer came to David during those 3 months of reflection. It wasn't because God didn't want the ark in Jerusalem. It wasn't because the ark was cursed. It was because they had failed to follow God's instructions for how the ark was to be transported. And that failure wasn't just a small oversight, it was a major mistake that needed to be corrected. David took those 3 months to carefully study God's word and understand what had gone wrong. He realized that the ark was meant to be carried by Levites, not placed on a cart. The law was clear. There were prescribed ways to handle holy things, and the Ark of the Covenant was one of the holiest. It was a representation of God's presence, and it needed to be treated with the utmost reverence and care. The ark wasn't just another piece of treasure, it was a sacred object, and its transportation was to be handled with respect for God's commands. This realization, however, didn't just correct a logistical mistake. It led to a profound change in David's actions and heart. You see, when David learned that he had made a mistake, he didn't just brush it off or ignore it. He didn't try to justify his actions or say, "Well, I was doing my best." Instead, he took full responsibility for the mistake and sought to make it right. David's desire to worship God properly became the driving force behind his decision to try again. This time, it wouldn't be about what seemed best to him or what looked good in the eyes of others. This time, it would be about honoring God in the way that He had commanded. David's desire to worship God properly is so evident when we look at how he prepared for the journey of the ark to Jerusalem. This wasn't just about getting the ark from one place to another. It was about making a public declaration that God was at the center of everything. David had come to understand that true worship wasn't about outward appearances or about what other people thought. It was about the heart. And so, David went about preparing for the ark's journey with humility and a heart focused on honoring God. When the time came to bring the ark to Jerusalem, David did something that was very telling about his heart. He wore a simple linen ephod instead of his royal robes. Now, this might seem like a small detail, but it's incredibly significant. David was the king of Israel, after all. He could have worn his royal robes, his crown, and all the regal symbols of his power and position. But instead, he chose to dress like a common priest in a simple garment that was worn by the Levites, who were the ones actually carrying the ark. By choosing to dress in this humble way, David was making a powerful statement. He was saying, "It's not about me. It's not about my position. It's not about my wealth or my power. It's about God. I am nothing compared to His greatness." This was a moment of profound humility. David could have stood out in all his royal splendor, drawing attention to himself, but instead, he blended in with the Levites. He wasn't there to show off his own glory, he was there to honor the glory of God. And by wearing the linen ephod, David was saying that, in God's presence, all earthly power and prestige meant nothing. What mattered was his willingness to humble himself before God and to worship him with the right heart. But David didn't stop there. As the ark was brought into Jerusalem, there was a celebration like no other. There were shouts of joy, songs of praise, and music played by musicians. It was a festival of worship. And David, with all his heart, joined in. He didn't stand aloof, watching the proceedings from a distance. He didn't reserve himself as the king, staying in his royal position. No, David joined the people in their celebration. He danced before the Lord with all his might, and his joy in God was contagious. This wasn't a king performing for an audience. This was a worshiper, completely caught up in the glory of God. David's dance before the Lord was an outward expression of an inward joy. He was so overwhelmed with gratitude for what God had done, both in his life and for the nation of Israel, that he couldn't contain his praise. He didn't care how it looked to anyone else. He wasn't concerned about being dignified or reserved. He was simply worshiping God in the way that his heart overflowed. He wanted to celebrate God's greatness. And he wanted everyone to know that God was the one who deserved all the glory. This was a critical turning point for David. It wasn't just about moving the ark, it was about recognizing that God alone was worthy of praise. It was about understanding that true worship is not about following rituals or traditions for the sake of tradition. It's about offering our hearts to God in humility and in joy. True worship comes from a place of gratitude, from a heart that is in awe of God's greatness and mercy. David understood this, and that's why he could dance with all his might before the Lord, even in the face of public scrutiny. Now, it's important to note that David's celebration wasn't without criticism. His wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, saw David dancing and despised him for it. She couldn't understand how her husband, the king, could lower himself to such a display of undignified behavior. She thought it was inappropriate for a king to act in such a way. But David wasn't worried about what Michal thought. In fact, he responded to her criticism by saying, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house." In other words, David knew that his actions were driven by his love for God, not by a desire to please other people. He was not interested in being dignified for the sake of dignity. His concern was to worship God with a sincere heart, and that's exactly what he did. David's actions in this moment teach us a powerful lesson about true worship. Worship isn't about appearances. It's not about how we look or how we're perceived by others. Worship is about the heart. It's about giving God the honor he deserves, whether anyone is watching or not. David didn't care about his dignity. He didn't care if people thought he was making a fool of himself. What mattered to him was that God was being honored, and he was willing to humble himself in whatever way it took to give God the glory. The key to understanding this moment is to see it in light of David's earlier failure. In his first attempt to move the ark, he made a mistake. He didn't follow God's instructions. But here, in this second attempt, David had learned. He had learned the importance of obedience, of worshiping God the right way. And it wasn't just about getting the logistics right, it was about the heart behind the worship. David's humility in dressing like a common Levite and his unrestrained celebration of God's presence in his life were signs that he had learned what true worship really was. It was a worship that was not concerned with how it looked to others, but only with honoring God from the heart. In this moment, David's heart was completely aligned with God's. He was doing what God had commanded, but he was also doing it with the right heart. And that's the kind of worship that God desires from us. Not just outward acts, but a heart that is fully surrendered, fully devoted, and willing to humble itself before him. David's dance before the Lord was a beautiful expression of that kind of worship, a worship that is authentic, that comes from a place of joy and gratitude, and that is completely focused on honoring God. This was a turning point for David, but it's also a challenge for us. How often do we let pride or concern for how we look prevent us from worshiping God with all our heart? How often do we hold back in our worship, worried about what others might think. David's example shows us that true worship requires humility and joy. It requires that we are willing to let go of our dignity, our pride, and our concern for appearances in order to worship God with all that we are. David's humility, his simple linen ephod, and his dance before the Lord teach us that true worship is about putting God at the center of everything, acknowledging that He alone is worthy of all glory and honor, no matter what anyone else might think. As David's celebration of the ark's arrival into Jerusalem continued, there was one person who didn't share in the joy, the one person who should have been the most excited, but instead, she stood in judgment. That person was Michal, David's wife, the daughter of Saul. Michal, as we know, was no stranger to the royal life. She had grown up in the palace, surrounded by power, status, and dignity. She was a woman accustomed to the expectations of royalty. And when she looked out of the window and saw David, the king of Israel, dancing in the streets before the Lord with all his might, wearing a simple linen ephod and surrounded by the people, her heart wasn't filled with joy. No, Michal despised him. The Bible tells us that she looked upon David with contempt, and in her heart, she saw what he was doing as beneath his royal dignity. She thought that the king of Israel, the anointed one, should act with more decorum, more self-respect, and certainly more dignity than to dance in such an undignified manner. David, in his exuberance and joy before the Lord, didn't care about the opinions of others. He wasn't concerned with his royal status. His heart was solely focused on worshiping God, and in his mind, nothing else mattered. He was expressing his gratitude, his love, and his devotion to the one who had been with him through every victory, every trial, and every challenge. But Michal, from her position in the palace, couldn't see that. She saw David's actions as shameful, a king lowering himself in such a public way. It's important to understand that Michal's reaction wasn't just a matter of personal preference or taste. It was deeply rooted in her understanding of royalty and the way things should be done. To her, royalty meant dignity, restraint, and a certain level of pride. And she expected that from her husband, but David didn't see things the way Michal did. For him, worshiping God with joy and abandon was far more important than upholding any sense of royal dignity. He was willing to humble himself, to set aside his kingly robes, and to wear a simple linen ephod. His humility in worship was a sign of his deep love for God, and he wasn't going to let pride or public opinion get in the way of that. When Michal confronted David about his undignified behavior, she said to him, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." Her words were cutting, and they revealed her heart. She was more concerned with how David looked in front of others than with the heart of worship that motivated his actions. She thought his behavior was inappropriate, disrespectful, and beneath his station. In her eyes, the king of Israel should have acted with more restraint, more authority, and certainly more dignity. But David's response to her criticism was powerful and revealing. He replied, "It was before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." David's response shows us two important things. First, he was not concerned with appearances or reputation. What mattered to him was honoring God. Second, he understood that his kingship was not about his own power or status. It was about God's calling and anointing. It was God who had chosen him, not because he was the most dignified or the most powerful, but because God saw his heart. David wasn't interested in defending himself in front of Michal or anyone else. His only concern was that his actions brought glory to God. What's heartbreaking, though, is what happened to Michal after this moment. The Bible tells us that she had no children to the day of her death. Now, the text doesn't explicitly say why this happened, but it's hard not to see the connection between Michal's heart and her barrenness. Could it have been a judgment from God? Perhaps, but even more likely, her lack of children was a reflection of the spiritual barrenness in her heart. Michal's inability to see the beauty of David's worship, her contempt for his humble expression of joy before the Lord, speaks to a deeper issue in her life. She was more concerned with her own image, with outward appearances, than with the true worship of God. And that kind of attitude can lead to barrenness in the soul. When we become too focused on ourselves, when we become too concerned with how we look to others, we can lose sight of the true purpose of worship, to honor God with all our hearts, without reservation, without pride. David's heart, on the other hand, was a heart of worship. He didn't care how it looked to anyone else. He was willing to make himself humble before the Lord because he understood that true worship was about giving God all the glory, not about protecting his own image. David's response to Michal shows us what true worship looks like. It's not about being dignified or maintaining a certain reputation. It's about giving everything to God, laying down our pride and worshiping him with all our heart, soul, and strength. David was willing to be humbled in his own eyes, and in doing so, he honored God. The contrast between David and Michal is a powerful lesson for all of us. When it comes to worship, God is not interested in our outward appearances or our status. He is interested in our hearts. True worship is not about how we look to others. It's about how we respond to God. It's about offering ourselves completely to Him without holding anything back. It's about being willing to humble ourselves before Him, no matter what anyone else thinks. And it's about recognizing that our worship is not for our own benefit or glory, but for God's alone. Michal's story serves as a warning to us all. When we become too focused on how we appear to others, when we let pride and self-image get in the way, we miss the heart of worship. Worship is not about impressing others or maintaining a certain image. It's about humbling ourselves before God and giving Him the glory He deserves. And just as David's humble worship brought honor to God, it also brought honor to David. Michal, on the other hand, allowed her pride and self-righteousness to keep her from fully participating in the worship of God, and the result was spiritual barrenness in her life. The lesson is clear. True worship is not about us. It's not about how we look, how dignified we appear, or how we are perceived by others. True worship is about giving our hearts to God, humbling ourselves before Him, and seeking His glory above all else. It's about being willing to become undignified in the eyes of the world, if it means that we are honoring God with our lives. When we worship God with sincerity, with joy, and with humility, we open our hearts to His presence, and we allow Him to move in ways that transform us. That's what true worship is all about. And that's what David understood. Let us learn from David's example and approach God with the same heart of worship, willing to lay down our pride and worship Him in spirit and truth. As we reflect on the story of David and his journey to bring the ark to Jerusalem, the key message is clear. Worship is about keeping God at the center of everything. It's about honoring Him with our hearts, with our obedience, and with humility. David's willingness to learn from his mistakes and seek God's guidance shows us how important it is to stay humble and obedient in our own walk with God. Whether it's in our worship, our decisions, or our daily lives, we're called to seek God first and keep Him at the heart of everything we do. Let's take this lesson to heart. Let's approach our own lives with the same heart of worship and humility, putting God at the center of all we do. If you enjoyed this message, feel free to like and subscribe for more inspiring content. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time.